Okay, so I'd like to welcome everyone to the Purple Cloud podcast. And this episode, we're talking to Justin Penoyer, who wrote a chapter of this. Way I've disappeared. This book, The Legacy of Chinese Shamanism, the Wu and their successors. And Justin is a also a Chinese medicine practitioner practicing out of Hanover, Illinois, and he really has a really great in-depth knowledge of early Chinese philosophy and culture and how it relates to Chinese medicine. So welcome today, Justin.
Thanks for having me. Really happy to sit down with you here today.
Yeah, me too. And your chapter of this book was really fascinating. It focuses on the Huainanzi. Now, for anyone out there who might not be familiar with this book, and its relationship with Chinese medicine, maybe you could give people a little bit of an introduction.
Sure, absolutely. And so this is going to be a text coming out of the mid-second century BCE and composed uh, in, somewhere, let's say, between the years approximately from the reign of Emperor Jing and Wen, and so becoming published approximately mid-century and then presented to Emperor Wu, excuse me, uh, toward the end of that century, and is considered to be sort of a seminal text coming out of early China,
And how did
and got
you,
my attention.
sorry, I was going to ask, yes, exactly. How did it get your attention? Where did you first come across this book?
Sure. So came across it about 5 years ago when I really wanted to start investigating the models of thought that we find in the Neijing, and uh, and was not my intent at the time to utilize the Huainanzi in order to help achieve that. But it happened to be something that I encountered early on and kind of caught me by surprise. It ended up becoming a text that was more than what I expected at first, as sort of a political treatise. And then ended up recognizing a similar language between that and the Ling Shu, which I had been studying in depth
Mm.
prior to that.
And
And so, yeah,
yeah, and it's informed your clinical practice a little bit, as I understand.
absolutely, yeah. So that's part of the uh, was part of the goal as well, is to try to see if there was some context to again to the language and the system that I was presented in the Neijing. And then encountering those in the Huainans has been helpful to uh, fill in, language and thought that goes beyond just what is mentioned in the Neijing. And so, uh, just whether it's root branch structuralism or, for example, the model of the tree that shows up in the Ling Shu, and just really understanding where they're coming from as much as possible,
Mm.
and finding that the Huainanzi is located proximal to the Neijing is useful for clinicians who want to investigate some of the philosophy that lies behind the techniques that we employ in the clinic. Um, and so, encountering again quite a bit there, more than what I had expected uh, initially. Yeah.
Mm. And in reference, you've written this great chapter of this book, and it focuses on a very particular element of the Huainanzi, that being of the shaman. And you also do talk a little bit about how it relates to medical practice and how these sort of things are tied together. But let's start at the beginning. Yeah, would you like to introduce some of the concepts of the how the shaman exists and is seen in the Huainanzi?
Absolutely. So this subject was also something that ended up being a discovery process and not something I sought out as a subject to pursue initially. And ends up becoming curious because it was not an area of particular interest to begin with, but then ended up becoming an area of interest, both due to life experiences and then also uh, the way that the Huainanzi utilizes shamans as well. And so part of the interest again is being a shared language and perspective that we find between the Neijing and the Huainanzi. So its particular representation of shamans ends up becoming something that we find congruent with the subject as we find it presented in the Neijing as well. So shamans, to understand how they're being utilized in the Huainanzi, um, what it is somewhat dependent on the context of what the authors of the Huainanzi were trying to do in general at that time, which was Liu Wan's court was a center for the Southern intellectual tradition that was still distinct at that time in China, and compiling and gathering what were considered to be achievements of Southern Chu culture, whether it was the Zhuangzi, Guanzi, Huainanzi, for example.
So this Chu
And
culture was something that was quite distinct.
it was correct. It was still distinct at that time, and and uh, uh, was was also being written during a time where Chu culture was quite popular at the imperial court as well, which was not popular with everyone there at the imperial court, as it would end up playing out, in the power struggles that
Hmm.
unfolded over that century. But after Liu Bang won and China was unified, it was exhausted from decades of intense interstate warfare, and there was a call for a true revival to sort of revive the spirit of the country.
Yeah, this is
And
something that's quite interesting in the history, as people will often look back to the Han period or before and think it is this monoculture, and it was very much not a monoculture, and there were these sort of distinct ideas floating about, which makes things a little trickier.
yeah,
Yeah.
and part of me was unsatisfied at the beginning of my investigations at this idea. These some of these models just kind of drop in and out of nowhere. Neijing is a grab bag of
Mm.
techniques and thought, and especially in reading the Ling Shu, more so than Su, is to me, I found a distinct narrative, and then found that narrative again, in Huainanzi, but that we can sort of parcel apart a little bit more context as to where these thoughts come from, and that's why I adhere to the term Huang Lao, because we're finding a distinct um, voice that comes from a cultural expression that ranged from Qi state down into Chu, but generally encompassing the riverine coastal cultures of China, going back all the way to the fact that the capitals of Qi and Chu were both the only ones on portable rivers, and so have been in communication for quite some time. But for example, like Qi naturalism in the Huainanzi and versus sort of southern Chu channel theory, for example, being wet. But to get to the shamans, what the Huainanzi is doing is actually quite interesting, and is sort of in contrast to how often shamans even appear in the Huainanzi, which is not very often. But when they appear is happens to be important, and smallness in the Huainanzi is actually prized. So to find them appearing, in small ways is not surprising. But generally, what the authors are trying to do is create an all-encompassing manual, of course, but also harmonizing and bringing together sort of as if bringing together the four directions, competing thoughts at the time, and also trying to rectify in the South the rise of naturalism, in fact, and 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 these intellectual strains that were redefining how the cosmos worked, while at the same time preserving some of the older shamanistic traditions of China, of all of China, but for them especially, in southern China. And so, as our colleague Gohan explains in his earlier chapters in the book, the shamans were undergoing a progressive decline in stature and prominence within the society. And so, in this book, what we find is that they carve out a specific role for the shamans, and then also at the same time use that role to exemplify their position on the importance and order and balance of Wen and Wu, civility, martiality, which
That's
had
something we
been
might need to come back to, because that you do
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that distinction.
Yeah, that ends up becoming really a critical distinction that underlies this conversation and goes back to when the Zhou uh, ascended and conquered the Shang, and this idea all the way to then of utilizing ritual and warfare at the right time,
Mm.
and understanding that there's different rules of engagement for both,
With when you
and that both
translate when as civility and wu as martiality, is that correct?
that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these are categorical distinctions, right? So it's not only ritual. If we're talking about medicine, when is supplementation, for example, and wu is draining. And if we get to politics, when is enoughtment in the Huainanzi, a feudalistic structure,
Mm.
and which is based off of the Western Zhou, which is what the Huainanzi was advocating for, uh, a neo-feudalistic structure. And then Wu is centralization in the Huainanzi. They didn't want a strong centralized state, and that ends up becoming this discussion on on decentralized, which is not even my favorite term for that, but decentralized and centralized governance, um, which happens to be the same model that we find in the Neijing, which again is putting these quite proximal because that came about at a very specific time in later second century BCE. And so the authors of the Huainanzi uh, have a lot of discussion about the difference between form and chi, or form and spirit, what we can't see on the inside versus what we can see on the outside. And so they're carving out a role for shamans and sages, ritualists, um, and physicians to exemplify several different points. And so if we look at the one most specific to medicine initially in chapter 16, we're seeing uh, uh, also a statement about the identity of what medicine was conceived of at the time, which is something that I find useful for myself right now in answering the question for myself. What is the goal of my interaction with my patient? How do I define that? And how do I compare what I do to what other people do? And so in chapter 16, you find that, as we do in the other chapters, that shamans are relegated to the world of form in the Huainanzi, how things appear, and which is congruent with other texts within the Huanglao tradition as well. And so it's this belief that you can't reach out and touch chi directly. And so shamans are being used in order to act on what I call memory or ideations, to act on people's thought forms, and that's one interesting qualification to point out to everyone, that form is not just the shape of your body or your actions. The Huainanzi also specifies that these are thought forms, which is why I say ideation. and so belonging to the realm of the external appearances. And so, looking at for example, chapter 9, we see that shamans are not given supernatural agency within the Huainanzi, which is consistent with the text overall and with the Neijing as well. So it denies the agency of ghosts and sympathetic magic. So then we go, well, what are shamans doing exactly? And and uh, and so what they're doing is occupying a somewhat of a middle ground, similar to positions, and is to where they're not sitting down and touching patients. For example, in chapter 16, they're sitting down and performing rituals, which calms the patient and allows their shen to settle, or their chi to settle, excuse me, which allows their shen and their attention to return to the interior, which in our Taoist thought is how things return to origin and health and correctness. Uh, so it's not that that their rituals, the items of the intended ritual, this is very Zhuangzian, receives actually the benefit or is pleased by that ritual, but it in essence, I don't want to say tricks, but gives the appearance of resolution that then calms down the individual, which allows their chi dynamic to correct. And that's where I like to emphasize that chapter 16 emphasizes this point that the shaman, the ritualist, and the physician are compatible because they share this, they're coming from the same place and they're sharing the same goal, which is understanding that they're rectifying chi dynamics and returning someone to their their original nature. So that's what's interesting about this is that, again, this is a balance of Wen and Wu, civility, martiality, transparency, and deceit, is that they acknowledge that, unfortunately, you just can't explain chi dynamics to everyone. And so rationalizing with everyone is simply not possible. And so the sages learned long ago that they have to come up with, accept the fact that people are going to get startled and that you have to come up with stories and means of appeasement to get them to calm back down because you can't explain the actual reason, for their
That's interesting
disturbance.
because I find in clinic where my mind went, and these days I need to come up with a kind of a biomedical narrative for the chi dynamic rather than a describing it in terms of something a bit more supernatural or this kind of thing. But I rarely use these. I don't know about you, but I rarely use this terminology in clinic. Sometimes I do, but often not. But I think because the framework of the world is quite materialist and biomedical, that's the kind of narrative structure I tend to frame things in, however accurate it may be or not, but it's generally pretty well received by people. And using analogy, naturalistic analogy, which is something most people I find can resonate with. A little bit of a offshoot, but it something clicked in my mind there a little bit because we're obviously in a very different society today.
Absolutely. The goal has to be returning one's attention to their interior, right, in this medicine. And so people can self-rectify and correctly locate. And this was a controversial thing to say at the time, as were many things in the Huainanzi, because it was directly condemning the imperial Confucian omen theories that were being formed, um, that were looking at reality in such a way as nature expressing, messages that were conveying uh, the mandate of heaven in accordance with it or not, and that omens were designed to startle people in essence. It was startling, changing, right? But then also at the same time, the imperial calendar reforms that occurred, 15 odd years after this text, um, uh, uh, the calendars weren't in sync anymore and things were out of place. And so when you have a society that is widely utilizing day books, for example, and thinking about auspicious and inauspicious days and activities based off of calendrics that weren't in line with reality anymore. Things were showing up at the wrong place at the wrong time and startling people. So that's where also in chapter 9 we see that's part of the duty for ritualists to make sure that all spaces are attended to, that rituals are correct, to avoid anyone becoming startled to begin with. Because if all people feel cared for and feel understood, which also gets into what you just said, we need to talk to people in such a way as they feel cared about and understood. That's part of that empathetic resonance. That if things are arranged, the best way to not have issues is to not allow them to have space to become an issue. And so that's where, again, they put shamans at this level to where they're sort of viewed as a necessary thing, that people are going to demand them no matter what. And because we just live in an age that isn't perfectly ordered now. And which is interesting because that gets to one of the characters in this book, Ginseng Roots, happens to be who was a shaman among the Hmong people in Vietnam, right?
So we
Across the
should
United
back up a
States.
little bit and let everyone know a
Yeah.
little bit about Ginseng Roots, which is the other book you've been involved in. It's a graphic novel, I think is what people like, or, comic illustrated novel. And you feature in that book. I've read it. It's really fantastic. And it's about, growing ginseng in America.
And yeah, great. It's a wonderful narrative
Mm.
that sort of similar to the Huainanzi. I thought it was about a political narrative and ended up becoming a deeply spiritual narrative that has changed me in some very real ways. And one would find that engaging ginseng roots as well, is that ginseng ends up becoming sort of a locutor of meaning upon which the narrative revolves. And then we get to talk a bit about Chinese medicine. And in there, there is a gentleman who, yes, was a shaman, and then decided he didn't want to be a shaman and became a priest. And then years later, the people come back to him saying that they need him, right? They to help guide excuse me. And so the so in short, shamans are serving a purpose in there to help guide and correct the people, just as acupuncturists are. And they do this clever thing in drawing equivalency, where shamans might not reach out and touch you, but they evoke remembrance and get you to remember, like, oh, I'm calmed down. And this comes up in the clinic too. For example, my last patient is like, yeah, it's just amazing thing finally, happened. I felt secure again, and I could just like feel the pressure melt off my shoulders,
Mm.
things like that. And the power of narrative framing, as we call it, which is one of our jobs too, right? Like words communicate essence just like needles do.
Hmm.
And all of it makes a lot more sense when we understand form includes ideology, ideations. We don't think just like in the work that you wrote, fantastic. I was enjoying about images, these things that occupy this middle ground. They have an outline in our head,
Mm.
and we think things look right. That's why I like to think more as maps, like
Mm.
an image of the situation. If I were to say it more complete, situational awareness, if we were to bring in sort of military speak, and people get an image of the situation, something's wrong, something's amiss, and shall come along, invoke rituals, chant, concord with a pre-existing idea of the way things are supposed to be, which is not prized in the Huainanzi or the Zhuangzi tradition. We don't want that. But nonetheless, in doing so, they are sort of reaching out and acting on that thought form and actually using the forms of sacrificial objects to achieve the same thing. They're not acting directly with qi, which ends up becoming an important distinction here in just a second. because the physician is doing the same thing. And when we look at this tradition, that even goes back sort of to the Zhuang, is that physicians were aligning with what we might call Bruist scholars in wanting to moralize the universe and saying that actions are the result of your illness, not just demons. And disavowing, which was also a political thing, disavowing the emperor or the king's direct contact with spirit directly. And when we get to like Chunyu Yi, for example, toward the end of or the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, just ahead of the Huainanzi, that the physician from Qi, whose case studies are the oldest that we have now. A same argument is that we're making this case is that they're distinguishing themselves from ritualists and diviners, shamans, who could claim that they were making direct contact with Shen. I mean, shaman inviting a spirit into their body, for example. And whereas they're saying, no, I can't manipulate Qi directly. I have to use form, what I can touch, to shape what I can't touch. And using the external, which ends up becoming the Huang side of things, and Huang Lao, even the external differentiated surface of the Tao, where our techniques lie. And then we puncture that or modulate that to change the internal dynamic. And so once again, the authors of Huainanzi are saying these two things are equivalent. Both have the goal of calming the Qi dynamic, because when the Qi is unsteady, the Shen departs. Now, because the space isn't organized, right? And which ends up becoming, again, that's a discussion that was being had for some time and goes back into military doctrine as well, and where I explained some of that in the text, that this was a military philosophy that was quite old at that particular time, about using the shape of things, the arrangement of things, to affect, for example, the morale of your opponent. And so then ahead of this ends up becoming sages who aren't really involved in the world in the Huainanzi. They're out of sight and helping design things so there aren't issues to begin with, but that's inevitable that they do. So we have a hierarchy of servants who come into play, who act upon form in various ways, hopefully at their incipient stages, when they're small, to get them to self-correct, which is considered to be the best way to never lose a war is to not have war to begin with. But barring that, the best intervention is the one that shows up and initiates self-correction, in the other. So I found this valuable in ways that would transcend the time that we have for our conversation now, but not least of which is helping understand some of the identity, both of physicianship, and then also Qi dynamics at the same time. And while doing so, understanding some of the origins of again, where our medical philosophy, originates in. Which is important, especially in the system of Huainanzi, because if you're not, your identity is taken from when and where you manifest, your origins. And so not knowing sort of where we come from in some of that context ends up making it difficult again to find identity today. And so, yeah.
And you also put a lot of, quite a bit of emphasis on this story. It's in the Zhuangzi as well as the Huainanzi, on the all seasons shaman, or the shaman all seasons, which is kind of the same story that gets repeated in both these texts. Maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about this.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, shamans only appear a few times and um, and never by name. And so he's called a spirit like shaman, to be clear, in the Huainanzi. They don't name him. But it's likely they didn't need to because the story was already a couple hundred years old by the time the authors were writing about it and compiling it there at Li Yuan's court, probably while they were compiling the Zhuangzi at the same time. So he does show up, as you mentioned, in the Zhuangzi 7, the last of the inner chapters, which is an extension to, in my opinion, of chapter 6, that they really need to be read together to be comprehended at a decent level. And so this is a really interesting story because we're also seeing the authors differentiate their system of Dao Shu and self-cultivation from not only Dao Yin, life extension practices,
Maybe you could
but
quickly
also,
relate the story for anyone who's not familiar with it.
so what happens is there is we might say Taoist adept, Lietza, who encounters a spirit like a shaman who is well known in his village. And the story is told in full in the Zhuangzi. It's much abbreviated in Huainanzi. And that basically Shaman All Seasons has a reputation for being able to prognosticate and tell you when and where and exactly how you're going to die, for example. And which the Huainanzi de-emphasizes prognostication, and as we find. And so he encounters Lietza introduces him to his master, Hutsa, and Shaman All Seasons sees Hutsa and goes, "Oh my gosh, you look ashen like the metal element. You're going to die." And I mean, looking at facial complexion was a big thing at that time, right? And that was we can look at you and see your insides from your complexion, and and then unfolds a story that is highlighting the self cultivation practice that it advocates. So Hutsa hears this, and in the Huainanzi, he takes a deep breath from his heels, lets it out, and pretty much moves on with his day, and viewing life and death as equal. And so, which is something we've talked about, right? Is as understanding life and death is equal as a prerequisite to moving through life without becoming startled by appearances. And so, the story in the Zhuangzi as it unfolds, the shaman all seasons is known in his village again for the same thing as being very good with reading the external world and then telling you what's going to unfold as a result. And so much so that Lietza runs into him and is like, "Wow, you really know what you're talking about." And goes back and reports it to Hutsa. And Hutsa's like, I don't know that you really understand. And do you really understand the internal dynamic? And Shaman again comes in and looks at him and goes through, it's a little bit longer story that unfolds over several days, but sees him and says, "Yeah, you're about to die." And then comes back the next day and looks at Hutsa and goes, "Oh, you're going to live." And then comes back the next day, he's like, "Oh, this is getting weird." And on the fourth day, he's like, he looks at Hutsa and flees in terror. And if you really want to understand, again, this story, I encourage you to start with chapter 6 because it talks about exactly the goal of what we just said is that through self-cultivation, we understand that life and death are equal. In fact, they inhabit our body in different places already, and not to be perturbed by them, and that the stage, the genuine person, as it's talked about in the Zhuangzi, is able to bring it all together, and each time all seasons look at Hutsa shows him what Hutsa wants to show him, which are different manifestations of states, essentially, of the Tao, and like the earth of the Qi, or the Qi of the earth, for example, after, on the second day. And uh, and and his so the story ends up becoming a little bit different in the Huainanzi because they first off they give him this name All Seasons, which is significant um, as a tangent conversation, but that calling him a spirit like shaman is important because it's acknowledging that this shaman actually has uh, good perceptual capacity. He legitimately sees things that other people don't.
Mm.
It's spirit-like vision. But this is of the external world of appearances, and he becomes startled and easily upset in the Zhuangzi, pointing out his inferiority at even being concerned about external arrangements whatsoever. Um, but external arrangements are very important in the Huainanzi and Huanglao philosophy because the goal is really to have an unpreconditioned consciousness so you can use your tools to measure reality accurately. So you are not biased and then therefore a moral and efficacious person, and leader. And so it doesn't deny the importance of external appearances, but even more important that in a deeper level of cultivation, as Hutsa breathed in the yin, exhales the yang, breathing in the new, exhaling the old, which is one of the things that they differentiate between the huffing and puffing of Dao Yin and self-cultivation. The Zhuangzi, it says that they breathe from the heels and the masses breathe from their throat, for example.
Mm.
Same thing. And so that he doesn't care. He just doesn't care. Rolling with the punches, also very Zhuangzian. He's not startled by omens.
Mm.
He doesn't care about external appearance. So what? He says, basically, like, it does not move me, does not change me, does not disturb my internal environment. And I don't do that magically. I do that with my breath by inhaling the new and exhaling the old, right? Because they're working with that internal yin and yang and qi dynamic.
Could I ask you
Um,
your interpretation of this breathing through the heels? Because I've heard a lot of different interpretations, and I'm always curious to know if you've obviously thought about this a lot, how you would take that on.
I yes, and so there I would qualify this first off by saying I'm sure that there are there are elements to that I do not know, a narrative in scope beyond, but tying it to footprints, actions, the heel, and how important that is in Chinese philosophy, and um, uh, but what what is clear, for example, because you find this even just ahead of this all seasons appearance, is this idea, I would say, of breathing from the root, perhaps,
Mm.
tapping into root branch structuralism. But certainly it's breathing, perhaps a metaphor from breathing from one's true interior, right? Rather than from the superficial world, which is a frequent condemnation within the Huainanzi. Things are skin deep. People are playing to appearances on purpose. Uh, Most people can only stand, appearances, so their breath only goes to their throat instead of all the way down to the end of their body. Maybe that's Tong,
Mm.
right? Like it reaches all the way through, not just superficially. Um, which would make sense too, because we're talking about resonance theory within the Huainanzi, and in place of like the moral fabric type theory that we find being developed in the North. And so that's how I read it, but especially in that differentiating is that they're using breath um, as a means of regulating yin and yang um, to one's core, to one's full extent of their being.
Mm.
But it's a curious thing to think about. Perhaps, and I'm sure there's more to it, or I'm wrong on that too at the same time.
Hmm. Oh, very interesting.
Um, so this uh, it ends up again being one of those examples on how there's extensive dialogue around the story that appears that ends up um, and something that I enjoyed about your writing as well is that we understand that underlying the techniques that we use in the clinic is a like a better word, spiritual, but a religious persuasion.
Hmm.
You know, a view of being in the world tied directly to life and death and soul. And why is Hootsa taking a deep breath and not losing it? Why is that important? Not to, I mean, I hate to say it, but this is a big thing in both Zhuangzi and Huainanzi tradition is moving through life, not being startled. That's another one of my favorite stories. You in the boat, where the great you is in a boat and sailing. And dragon jumps out of the water and he's not startled. Well, why is that? And he takes a deep breath. He has experience. He knows that he's going to die someday anyway. There's no boogeyman in the world. There's only law. Um, and what they're emphasizing is it ends up becoming, in my opinion, a spiritual message about keeping the soul intact. I mean, they're pretty explicit about that. That if you reach the end of your life with little Shen left because it's departed your body because your chi dynamic is constantly disordered. As I read it, you essentially get almost recycled. And I'm pulling in other spiritual religious traditions that go way back into Egypt. But yeah, the common person didn't get to live forever. They were broken apart upon death. And the noble person got to live intact. And I feel that we're reading something very similar to that. With the whole goal of Dao Shu cultivation is keeping one Shen full so that when you die, you are able to cycle with the Dao
Hmm.
endlessly. Um, and so uh, that particular layer is also something that I find quite interesting. And so it ends up becoming something beyond just a sort of identity in terms of my profession, but this ends up becoming sort of a self-identity
Hmm.
uh, as well, and then passing that along um, to my patients, in sort of similar fashions. We can't move through life angry and fearful, in a fight or flight response all the time. We know that. And in the Ling Shu, well, like as you know, right, we're told we can serve as technicians, but it is possible to try to help guide patients and teach them, what serves them and what doesn't serve that. And so these matters of spirit, of course, come up in the clinic as well, don't they? With
But
our
they
patients.
certain, yeah, they very much do, and yeah, especially we need to understand that like ancient China was also a war-torn, crazy, chaotic place, and that's where these sorts of
Mm-hmm.
theories came out of and developed. And they can provide us some guidance with all of there's a lot of craziness going on in the world right now, and yeah, it's a lot of often similar themes are being recycled and readdressed. So yeah, they can certainly provide a lot of wisdom and guidance.
Absolutely. I think and this is something, and to acknowledge that at at a different level, of course, this is also a conversation about um, keeping China intact, keeping the Liu clan intact, perhaps
Mm,
keeping the neo-feudalistic structure intact by not throwing down too many barriers between the central government and the periphery, the feudal kings. But that, looking back at early China, that's part of the joy of it, in my opinion, is that you find there encapsulated really the same issues that we have today.
Mm.
human nature has not changed in that regard.
No,
And
it's
that's where I think that the authors achieved this in remarkable success within the book itself. I mean, which is the ability to produce a narrative that I would argue is indeed timeless
mm,
and transcends location. Now, you might be in the southern hemisphere right now, and I'm in the northern, and so we're looking at practically the same coin from two different sides, almost, so to speak.
mm,
But I think that your human nature is not different there, and probably won't be tomorrow or necessarily 20 years or 2,000 years.
mm,
While at the same time honoring the fact that there is a regionality that is, important as well. Um, and 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 so how to exist at these two different levels of one being a unified and diversified being at the same time, um, and being able to look backward in history and study it and use our intellect correctly that way to be able to learn from it, I think is highly valuable. Uh, and that certainly continues my interest within this text as well. I mean, it's not only, again, a technical um, engagement, but it's also, for me, a personal engagement. But then also, I look around my world, and yeah, absolutely. Do I draw from the fact that I think as what we have been through is nothing new, I
mm.
guess. Right.
Well, the
And that allows me also to remain calm and unstartled when strange things, strange diseases, strange
mm,
people, things that I seem I don't like appear. It doesn't move me
mm,
because I also understand that ultimately, I can understand the world and I still might die, and not see it coming. Um, and that's okay,
mm.
you know, um, to a certain extent, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
yeah, and so so I take a lot of value in that, but that ends up becoming a worldview too at the same time, as well. So I think
mm,
it's hard to kind of separate, as I do across the board, truly separate our spiritual religious values from the way that we operate in the world, certainly.
mm,
And so um, being able to uh, engage in this study, and again trying to understand as if they were my parents as much as possible, where did these thoughts originate,
mm.
and give them some kind of identity,
Yeah. Well,
um
thank you for your work, and I think it provides some much needed understanding in our field because yeah, the Neijing doesn't exist in a vacuum, and there's a lot there's a lot imbued in it that is maybe not inherently obvious at a sort of superficial reading. So yeah, I think we could talk for hours and hours about this, but I would encourage everyone out there to have a read, especially of his chapter in the shamanism book, but also on your website, Justin, which I can put in the links. There's a whole bunch of essays and writings and that kind of thing. And we touched a little bit on your ginseng growing and that kind of thing. But the ginseng roots project is also definitely something worth checking out. I really enjoyed it. Um, yeah,
appreciate
yeah. Is there
appreciate that.
anything else you'd like to add um
I'm
out
afraid
there?
if I do too much, I will keep you for an extended period. But one thing that we didn't
Well, we'll
get
have to
into
have.
that I would just encourage, our colleagues to check out too is it might seem like it's a narrative about, shamans, but there's a lot that is relevant to understanding chi dynamics that I think ends up becoming something valuable at a real practical level as well,
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
I think you made
yeah,
that. I took a lot of that from from our conversation today.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's yeah, I think it's very valuable reading and to learn about the roots of the medicine, which does have practical applications in the clinic as well, which I think you've done a
Absolutely.
really good job at addressing.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity, again, to sit down or and even the opportunity to present the material, in there, because in the course of doing so ended up becoming a project of self-discovery at the same time.
Mm,
And so I found it quite meaningful, and then, so hopefully other people do as well.
yeah. Well, thank you, Justin. We'll have to have you on again and continue our conversation.
Outstanding. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll see you later. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.